Everyone, this video will explore the world and diversity of land plants. And this is a very broad topic, and there are tons and tons of details that involve the study of plants. In fact, we could spend an entire semester discussing plants alone, and in fact, that would be called a botany class. But for the sake of our lecture today, we'll simply cover the key points that characterize the diversity of land plants, which turn out to, of course, have tremendous amounts of ecological importance in just about every terrestrial ecosystem that exists. And of course, we could talk about the importance of the sister taxa of land plants, the algae, in aquatic ecosystems, particularly in marine ecosystems. But for our video, we'll mostly focus on so-called terrestrial plants or land plants. So recall, again, the three major domains of life that we see in the Woos phylogeny: the bacteria, the archaea, and the eukarya. And of course, plants are eukaryotic, so they do fall within the eukaryotic branch of the tree of life. And if we were to zoom into the eukaryotic branch of the tree of life, we'd see that plants are classified as archaeoplastidans, which puts them in a clade with some other organisms that we classify as protists, namely algae, the charophytes, who are sister to land plants, and some earlier diverging lineages, the chlorophytes, and the red algae. By the way, the charophytes and chlorophytes are classified as green algae. And if we look at the general course of evolutionary history with plants, we can see that plants diverge from the common ancestor they share with green algae, something on the order of about 500 to 550 million years ago. So this image on the left illustrates some examples of what the common ancestors of plants, or rather the descendants of the common ancestors of plants that we call algae, look like. They're very simple organisms, often single-celled or not. And following the divergence of green algae from the lineage giving rise to land plants, the earliest diverging lineages we see are the so-called bryophytes. These are non-vascular spore-bearing plants. They're also, they're non-vascular spore-bearing plants that include mosses, hornworts, and liverworts. Later on in the evolutionary history of plants, there is another major divide where the lineage giving rise to ferns and their allies and lycophytes sort of branch off independently of one another at different points in time. And a lot of this has to do with the evolution of vascular tissue and the evolution of more advanced kinds of leaves. And then later on, we get to the development of seed plants. So the evolution of seeds comes along, and now we have plants that are vascular, that have tissues that can conduct water and nutrients, that also produce seeds. And seeds turn out to be a pretty important innovation that emerged something on the order of about 300 million years ago or so. And that gives rise to the clade of seed plants, or so-called spermatophytes, that include both the flowering plants and the non-flowering seed plants that we call gymnosperms. So we could think about green algae probably first evolving in water, something on the order of about 1.5 million years ago. So the ancient photosynthetic ancestors of land plants have been around for a very long time, maybe 3 times as long as land plants. They are far less diverse, the algae are, and they tend to be much simpler organisms that lack a lot of the complex structures we use to characterize land plants. But they are a group that is pretty closely related to land plants nonetheless. The so-called embryophytes, which is the technical term used for land plants, probably again first arose about 500 to 550 million years ago. And as we can see in our phylogeny, the progressive evolution, or the progressive evolutionary change that we see in the lineages of land plants, really do give rise to increasingly complex forms. And not only do they give rise to increasingly complex forms, but we really see this trend towards increasing adaptation towards life away from water. So some of the earliest diverging land plant lineages were able to survive away from water somewhat, although even their descendants today don't live very far away from water. As we see subsequent lineages diverge later on, or more recently, we can see that they have evolved adaptations that have allowed them to move even further away from water. So things like vascular tissue that allow them to transport water from the ground to stems above the ground. And then to things like the adaptations we see in seed plants, which are really, really fundamental adaptations that allow plants to survive desiccation or resist desiccation and really start to adapt to conditions far away from water and survive in areas that are relatively dry. And ultimately, these are adaptations that allowed land plants to colonize just about every single terrestrial habitat on the planet. One of the unifying themes we see in both algae and plants is this interesting life cycle they have, which we refer to as the alternation of generations. And the alternation of generations basically refers to this life cycle that alternates between a multicellular free-living haploid organism and a multicellular free-living diploid organism. So this is quite a bit different than we've seen in any of the other taxa we've discussed and probably will discuss into the future. We could think about this life cycle starting off in its haploid spore phase. So we have these haploid spores that are formed by meiosis, and these spores will germinate if given the chance, if provided with water. And those spores, once they germinate, will undergo mitosis, allowing them to become multicellular gametophytes. And those gametophytes typically can take on male and female gender roles that produce sperm and egg, respectively. And so these gametophytes produce gametes, as the name suggests. And when those male and female gametes, or those sperm and egg, come together by fusion, there is fertilization, and those haploid gametes give rise to a diploid zygote. And that diploid zygote will in turn undergo mitosis, so cell division, giving rise to a multicellular free-living sporophyte. And this free-living sporophyte will generally produce a structure like a sporangia that might be more identifiable in land plants than algae, I think. But anyway, that sporangia will undergo meiosis. And by the way, this is a diploid sporangia. And as that diploid sporangia is undergoing meiosis, it's producing its haploid spores, which will disperse away from the sporangia and give rise to haploid individuals that will eventually germinate and become gametophytes that are free living. That is, they don't depend upon the sporophyte for survival. And this whole cycle will typically repeat itself. So this theme is one that we see again in algae and in all of the land plants. And as we sort of march through looking at the different major lineages of land plants, we'll see that this theme is conserved across all plant taxa. However, there is some variation on it. And in some plant taxa, it's a lot easier to observe this life cycle compared to others, particularly when we get into seed plants. The gametophyte stage starts to become very, very inconspicuous. Whereas in earlier diverging land plants, such as bryophytes and ferns, we see that the gametophyte stage is really quite conspicuous. So I'd like to talk a moment about algae. As I mentioned, algae are the nearest relatives to land plants. So what are algae? Well, there are a multitude of different taxonomic groups within the protists that are classified as algae, and that would make them inherently a polyphyletic group. So there are a bunch of different algae-like forms that share very similar morphological characteristics and ecological characteristics in common, but not all algae necessarily inherited those traits from a common ancestor. In some cases, they have arisen independently in multiple lineages via convergent evolution. But in the nearest relatives to land plants, we do see that there is an interesting paraphyletic group of algae that all do share common ancestor, including the lineage that gave rise to land plants. So again, these are the charophytes, chlorophytes, and red algae. So this group is not polyphyletic, it's paraphyletic. And these are protists, and they are photosynthetic protists that exclusively, all exclusively occur in aquatic environments that did eventually give rise or eventually diverged into the earliest ancestors of land plants, probably something that was very similar to bryophytes, and we'll look at bryophytes in a moment. But what do these early diverging algae look like? Well, the rhodophytes are the first lineage we see that take off here in our Archaeoplastidon tree. And so these so-called red algae, as the name implies, have a sort of reddish look to them, and they vaguely sort of resemble plants with their branch-like structure, but they don't have true leaves, and they don't have all kinds of other structures that we typically see in land plants. But nevertheless, they are photosynthetic organisms, and they do have somewhat complex branch-like bodies that are some sort of plant-like. Later on, we see the archaeoplastidans giving rise to the lineage of chlorophytes. So we can see some examples of a chlorophyte here with Spirogyra. So this is a magnified image of Spirogyra. This is a photosynthetic chlorophyte. And then from that later split, we see that chlorophytes branched off from the lineage, giving rise to the clade of charophytes and land plants sometime later. And so the charophytes include things like volvox. So this is an image of volvox here. These, again, are photosynthetic green algae, or things like chara, which also are photosynthetic green algae that have stem-like structures. And these chara are starting to look a little bit more like land plants, but again, they don't have true leaves. They don't have vascular tissue. They're lacking a lot of the key components, again, that we do see in land plants. But nevertheless, these charophytes here do represent the closest ancestors, or the closest descendants of the common ancestor that is shared by green algae and land plants. So we could think of their common ancestor probably being an organism that was something a lot like these charophytes. And so, again, what really truly does make land plants different than green algae? Well, obviously, they both have very similar life cycles using the alternation of generations, but land plants have leaves, or structures that are very similar to leaves anyway. So here we see a whole diversity of different kinds of leaves. And as you might know, or as we will see anyway, the structure of leaves, the arrangement of leaves, the anatomy of leaves, and the function of leaves varies tremendously amongst all different kinds of land plant taxa. So the simplest leaves we see are in bryophytes. These are moss leaves here, and they are, as I suggested, just very simple leaves that are only one cell thick, don't have a whole lot of other features going on, but they can perform photosynthesis. And of course, that's their primary function. We can talk about things like these conifer leaves here that are slightly more complex, that are a little bit thicker, and are more desiccation resistant. We can talk about highly modified leaves that we see in ferns, which we actually refer to as sporophylls. And these sporophylls are specialized leaves that carry reproductive structures such as sporangia. So in fern leaves, if we were to look on the underside of a fern leaf, we would see the structure called sori. And within those sori, we would see the sporangia that produce the spores. And that is what makes these fern leaves kind of unique. They're not just doing photosynthesis, but they're also bearing reproductive parts. And later in plant evolution, we see that more complex sporophylls evolve, such as those that give rise to the production of both male and female cones in non-flowering seed plants, such as conifers, or very specialized sporophylls that give rise to structures like flowers in flowering plants, the angiosperms. So in fact, male and female cones and flowers are really highly modified leaves that we call sporophylls. We can also talk about leaves of flowering plants that have certain interesting defenses. And those defenses are basically designed to help these plants overcome various environmental challenges. And probably one of the most important environmental challenges plants have to overcome is water loss or desiccation. So, as I mentioned, one of the themes we see as plants are evolving towards increasingly drier conditions on land are traits that allow them to do well away from water. And so in this case here, this is an oak. These are oak leaves, and these oak leaves are really thick, and they are covered by this waxy cuticle. And this waxy cuticle helps them prevent water loss. And also, you might notice that these oak leaves are armed, or that is to say, they have spiny teeth on their margins. And what might be the purpose of those spiny teeth? Yeah, they help to deter herbivory. So animals, perhaps, that might want to try to make a meal out of this leaf are going to have a hard time doing so because these leaves are armed with teeth. And we could talk about even more highly modified leaves that arm plants, and we would consider these. We could think of things like cactus spines. So here is a magnified image of Opuntia, which is a cactus, and these are the areoles of Opuntia, and extending from the areoles of Opuntia are their spines. And what are these spines? These spines are highly modified leaves, and these leaves we might consider vestigial in a certain sense, such as to say they don't perform photosynthesis any longer. The photosynthesis is happening in the cactus pads or the stems of the cacti, whereas their leaves now have evolved to become highly modified as defensive structures that arm the cactus and protect it from animals trying to eat the cactus pads, presumably to get either food or water or both from within this type of plant. We can also talk about really intricately modified structures produced on stems and leaves that we call trichomes. You may have heard of before. So this image here at right shows a pretty nice magnification of what trichomes look like. These trichomes generally are referred to as hairs, and they're pretty microscopic or very, very small structures. You usually need some kind of magnification to see them. Oftentimes, botanists will use a jeweler's loupe or a hand lens like this, which has about 10 times magnification. And with 10 times magnification, we can usually see plant hairs pretty well. And sometimes these plant hairs are really sticky and glandular. They might have little glands at the tip. We kind of can see a little bit of glandularness in some of these trichomes. But there's variation in how sticky and how many glands these different hairs might produce. And then we can ask questions, well, what is the evolutionary significance of plants who have created trichomes, or that produce trichomes, I should say? Well, oftentimes these hairs can deter very small organisms from trying to make a meal out of these plants. So we're probably typically talking about small arachnids or insects, I should say small arthropods. So these hairs can be effective at preventing insects from sort of colonizing these plants and making a meal out of them. And when those hairs are particularly sticky, it can make it really difficult for small insects to travel around on these stems because they get stuck in the sticky glandularness of those hairs. So these hairs, again, provide defensive mechanisms in sort of different way than we can think of cactus spines providing defensive mechanisms, and kind of a different way than we can think of teeth on the margins of leaves providing defense. But nevertheless, these are various structures that evolved in plants to defend themselves. These obviously are leaves. These are leaves. These are hairs on leaves. And then we can look at the overall structure of a leaf in general. If we were to sort of zoom in to a cross section of a leaf, this cartoon here illustrates what we would see. Again, we'd see a waxy cuticle on the surface of the leaf, on the epidermis of the leaf, that sort of protects the leaf from desiccation, from water loss. Remember, water is a very important reactant in photosynthesis. Plants cannot do photosynthesis without water. Remember, that's happening in that first light reaction. And then beneath the cuticle, we see the upper epidermis, which is yet another layer of cells that is protecting the components within the leaf. And within the leaf are these mesophyll layers. And these mesophyll layers have some kind of fancy terms. There's the palisade mesophyll and the spongy mesophyll. And it is within the palisade mesophyll that photosynthesis is happening. So each of these cells here within the palisade mesophyll contain chlorophyll, chloroplasts with chlorophyll. And this is where photosynthesis is going to happen. And then oftentimes, more often than not, in fact, within the lower epidermis, these plant leaves have to have a way to exchange gas with the atmosphere, with the ambient environment around them. Again, plants are obtaining water for photosynthesis in some ways, but they also need a way to obtain carbon dioxide to feed it into the Calvin cycle in order to make sugar. And so how are plants going to get carbon dioxide into this leaf, into the palisade mesophyll where photosynthesis is happening? They have these very specialized structures called stoma or stomata. And these stomata are these little openings, these very, very small pores that can be seen with about, you might need a compound microscope to see them, but you can definitely see them with microscopy. And these stomata will generally open and receive some carbon dioxide and then close when carbon dioxide is not needed. And then when carbon dioxide is needed again, the stomata will open, allowing carbon dioxide to diffuse into the leaf. And when carbon dioxide is not needed, those stomata generally will close. Why are the stomata opening and closing all the time? Why don't they just remain open constantly? Well, not only are stomata able to permit carbon dioxide to enter the leaf, but stomata also allow water to leave from the leaf, to exit the leaf. And so we can see here that basically carbon dioxide's coming in through the stomata. This image actually doesn't show it, but water also can exit through the stomata, and that's not necessarily the best thing for plants, although we'll see way down the road that in some ways that process of evaporation kind of helps to pull water up through plant tissues, not in all plants, but in many plants. And also through these stomata is where oxygen leaves the plant. So we know that oxygen is a byproduct of photosynthesis. So as these stomata open, they're generally taking in carbon dioxide and releasing oxygen. And in the process, they're more often than not, losing some water, which is sort of happening beyond their control because water generally will evaporate into the atmosphere, basically diffusing from an environment of higher concentration within the leaf to an environment of lower concentration outside the leaf. So this is generally what the anatomy of a leaf looks like. And by the way, these stomata are surrounded by guard cells. And these guard cells are very, very specialized cells that allow the stomata to open and close, to expand and contract. If it wasn't for the guard cells, stomata wouldn't have the ability to be so flexible. Some plant leaves have vascular tissue that are called xylem and phloem, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But I cautioned you to know that not all plants have xylem and phloem. These are traits that are unique to vascular plants. These are vascular tissues. So there are some plants that don't have xylem and phloem. And even among the vascular plants, we can see some variation in the distribution of xylem and phloem within various tissues. The theme is not always consistent. But nevertheless, this is the generalized anatomy of a leaf that is pretty well conserved across most plant taxa. So the first major diverging lineages of land plants are the non-flowering spore plants. So these include the bryophytes and the pteridophytes. And basically, we can see those here represented by bryophytes, non-vascular plants, and by these ferns, their allies, and these lycophytes, which we call seedless vascular plants. So these are all non-flowering spore plants. And typically, these are plants that are not woody. So they're kind of more herbaceous. They're usually evergreen. That is to say that they produce leaves, and those leaves don't necessarily die away. They're generally green most of the time when the plants are alive or when the plants are active anyway. Some of these plants can become seasonally dormant, but typically when they're active, their leaves are green. These plants do not produce seeds, as we sort of saw on the phylogeny. They instead rely on spores for reproduction, and they almost exclusively occur in damp places. So this sort of reflects the fact that these early diverging land plants still are very much dependent upon water in order to have water for photosynthesis, but also they depend upon water for dispersing their spores, and they depend upon water for their gametes to successfully become involved in fertilization, and specifically for their sperm to be able to swim to fertilize eggs. So the sperm in these spore plants are flagellated, so they do require water in order to basically disperse into the environment and successfully find an egg cell to fertilize in order for the sporophyte to form. So we can think of things like mosses, which are bryophytes, being examples of non-flowering spore plants, or things like equisetum, these horsetails you may have seen before. These are also non-flowering spore plants, or of course things like ferns, being pretty familiar examples of non-flowering spore plants. Again, the earliest diverging lineages of non-flowering spore plants, as we saw here, are the bryophytes, which include mosses, hornworts, and liverworts. And bryophytes all generally share a similar life cycle, and that life cycle is characterized by a gametophyte stage that is really dominant And so the more familiar or more conspicuous body of bryophytes are actually their gametophytes. The leafy structures that we see are the gametophytes. So for example, this is Bryum argenteum, probably one of the world's most common mosses. You've probably seen it before. Maybe you didn't notice it, but I'm sure you've probably gone by this plant. It's a small stature plant. It's probably not much bigger than about that tall. But the leafy material of these mosses are their gametophytes. And their sporophytic stage is far less inconspicuous. These are the sporophytes here. We can see a little stalk coming up here and these capsules here that contain the sporangia within which the spores will be produced. And so this is the general theme that we see in bryophytes. And we can think about the bryophyte life cycle starting with, let's say, the formation of some spores that are formed by this sporophyte. And so the sporophyte will disperse its spores. And recall those spores were formed via meiosis in the alternation of generations. And so those spores will disperse into the environment. Again, they generally require water in order to disperse away, or wind, but generally they do disperse via water. And when water is available, those spores can germinate. And after those spores germinate, they undergo mitosis, so cell division, allowing those spores to become multicellular, but they're haploid. So we have multicellular haploid gametophytes. And those gametophytes will typically form along these structures we call rhizoids. And rhizoids are kind of stem-like, and they can produce some kind of root-like structures, but they're certainly not true stems, and they're certainly not true roots. They have no vascular tissue. These structures are not drawing water out of the ground, and they are not transporting water from one gametophyte to the next. The sole purpose of rhizoids is to give the gametophyte some structure, or that is to say, it gives the gametophyte a structure to attach to. And these rhizoids can sort of anchor the gametophyte into the ground, sort of like a holdfast that we see in algae. But these rhizoids will anchor into the ground, allowing this gametophyte to essentially attach to a substrate. That way it kind of has a place to undergo its life. And these gametophytes will grow up. They'll do photosynthesis. Again, these leaves are very simple. In mosses, they're single-celled leaves. And after they start to generate enough energy via photosynthesis, these gametophytes will start to differentiate into gametangia. And gametangia is sort of a fancy word for the reproductive organs in these bryophytes. And these gametangia are going to be either male or female. If they're male, we call them antheridia, and if they're female, we call them archegonia. And they produce these heads that we could call antheridial heads and archegonial heads. And within these various heads we see the production of either sperm cells or egg cells. And so once these gametophytes have successfully produced their gametangia, the various gametangia will release their respective gametes, either sperm or egg, and those gametes will come together via fertilization to produce a zygote. And that zygote now will be diploid. So we have, again, haploid sperm, haploid egg. They come together for fertilization to make a diploid zygote. And that diploid zygote is the sporophyte. And now, again, we're seeing the alternation of generations. This free-living gametophyte has now given rise to a sporophyte. However, the sporophyte in bryophytes is not necessarily free-living. In fact, we know that the sporophyte in bryophytes tends to stay attached to the gametophyte, which can provide some nourishment for the sporophyte. The gametophyte is still doing photosynthesis, so it's making sugars. Those sugars can be used as an energy source to nourish the sporophyte, allowing the capsule, which technically is called the calyptra, but it's also referred to as the capsule, allowing this reproductive structure to be formed within which meiosis is finally going to happen, allowing spores to be produced that ultimately are spewed away from the capsule and dispersed into the environment. And of course, these spores, as a product of meiosis, are haploid. And so that sort of completes our whole life cycle that we see in bryophytes, going from their sporophytic stage or their sporophyte stage to their gametophyte stage. And again, very important to recognize that in bryophytes, the gametophyte stage is really quite the dominant stage. We can look a little bit at the diversity of bryophytes. So again, these are the closest relatives to the earliest land plants. So those plants that first diverged away from the common ancestor land plant share with algae were probably very similar to bryophytes, probably had a very similar life cycle, probably very similar morphologies. And the bryophytes include about 18,000 species. So they're actually pretty diverse. And their taxonomy is not super well understood for various reasons. Again, these are rather inconspicuous plants. There's sort of a lack of experts interested in studying these things, particularly in parts of the world where bryophytes are relatively uncommon. So they don't get a whole lot of attention, but we do know they're actually fairly diverse and really in need of study. Most bryophytes, not surprisingly, do occur in relatively damp habitats. They require water, as all plants do, but because bryophytes lack vascular tissue, they really have to be close to water because the only way they can get water into their tissues is by diffusion. And so, by virtue of the fact that they require diffusion for water transport, bryophytes never grow above, again, larger, I should say, than about this big. It's simply just not possible for a plant like this to grow any larger because they can't move water against the force of gravity over any longer distance. So these plants are sort of necessarily distributed in relatively damp habitats, and they never really grow that big. But their distribution globally can vary quite a bit. Mosses, or I should say rather bryophytes, make up one of the most common kinds of flora found in tundra type environments. They're in fact one of the first kinds of organisms to colonize bare substrates that have been disturbed, for example, or that have become available for colonization. And they can occur in environments that are completely different than tundra, like tropical forests, both temperate, um, temperate forests and tropical forests, I should say. So if you were to go to the redwood forest, you'd probably see a lot of mosses or a lot of bryophytes all over the place. Likewise, if you were to go to the tropical forest, you'd also probably see a lot of bryophytes all over the place, covering all kinds of surfaces, covering rocks, covering tree bark, covering tree roots that are exposed. Bryophytes will attach to really any wet surfaces that they can in these kinds of environments. There are generally three major categories of bryophytes: the liverworts, the hornworts, and the mosses. Liverworts are probably the earliest diverging lineage of bryophytes we see. So they might represent something as similar as we can imagine to the earliest common ancestors of all land plants. They don't have true leaves, unlike mosses. They have what we call thallus. These are thallus here. In fact, these are the thallus of the female gametangia that we would call the archegonia. So these are archegonia here that are putting up their little sporangia, kind of look like little umbrellas. But these are the sporophytes, I should say. These are sporophytes, and within them are the sporangia, where spores will be produced. This is Asterella californica. And as a matter of fact, this, as that species epithet suggests, this is a species of liverwort native to California. In fact, we can find it in Southern California in our mountains in areas that are relatively sheltered and damp part of the year. There are also hornworts, which are far less common in Southern California, but common in other parts of the world. And these hornworts produce some kind of bizarre looking sporophytes that look like horns or resemble horns, and that's where they get their name from. So we can see the leaves of these hornworts here, or their photosynthetic structures that are leaf-like, and these sporophytes coming up. And then mosses, which are probably the most familiar bryophytes, perhaps the easiest to find. This is Timiella, one of the more common moss species that we have in Southern California. Timiella has these really sort of kind of asterisk-shaped leaves, if you were to look at them. And they also produce their sporophytes here with capsules, as we sort of saw before. And these Timiella, sort of like hornworts or liverworts, again, occur in relatively sheltered, damp places. But not all mosses necessarily do occur in moist, sheltered places. As a matter of fact, we know that there are some moss taxa that occur in arid environments like the deserts. For example, this is a moss probably in the genus Didymodon. Kind of hard to identify this at this stage of its life cycle, but most likely that is the genus. We know this genus occurs in deserts. This image was taken in the Mojave Desert in an environment that's extremely arid, not too far from Death Valley. And this moss might not really look alive. And we could sit here and kind of contemplate whether or not that moss is alive. And we could do an experiment with that moss and take maybe a little knife and take a knife and take a little piece of that moss and put it onto a petri dish and squirt a little bit of water onto those moss leaves that appear dead. And within just a matter of minutes, guess what's going to happen? That moss will suddenly spring to life, and that dryish looking tissue, which are actually leaves, will start to become green relatively quickly and will start to become photosynthetic relatively quickly. And this speaks of a very important aspect of the life history of bryophytes, particularly of mosses, which is that they can remain dormant for really long periods of time. It has been said that mosses often can sort of execute their life cycle in suspended animation. That is to say that really mosses are really kind of only active, at least in an environment like Southern California. They're really kind of only physiologically active in a small portion of the year, generally late winter and spring when it's been raining. Mosses will spring to life, start to do photosynthesis, start to undergo mitosis in the gametophyte stage, and form these sort of uh, familiar gametophyte bodies, these leafy bodies. And once enough photosynthesis has happened, those gametophytes will produce their sporophytes, which will, of course, undergo meiosis and form spores that'll disperse into the environment. And typically, after that happens, the wet season has come to an end and the dry season will begin. And those green moss leaves will start to become dormant and they'll cease to be green. They'll start to look more like this, and that they won't die. They'll remain alive, but they will remain dormant for months and months and months. And likewise, their spores that have dispersed into the environment remain dormant for months and months and months. So let's imagine all of this has played out in the month of April. And by the end of the month of April, these mosses have sort of finished undergoing photosynthesis, finished switching into the sporophyte stage, and have produced their spores. The moss leaves, the gametophytes will go dormant into May, June, July, August, September, etc. And the spores will remain dispersed in the ambient atmosphere, waiting for the next rainy season, which probably won't begin until about November or December of the same year, for those spores to germinate and for the gametophytes to begin absorbing water again, thus allowing this sort of life cycle that we see in bryophytes to repeat itself. So we can think about there being this interesting major pause in this bryophyte life cycle. That occurs both after the spores are dispersed from the capsule and after the gametophytes have sort of completed forming their sporophytes. So again, these gametophytes will sort of go dormant in suspended animation for as long as 6 or 7, maybe 8 months, and their spores will remain sort of intact, but not germinated yet in the environment. And both these gametophytes and these spores are sort of waiting for the right opportunity for the bryophyte life cycle to resume itself. So there is this sort of major pause that we see. And that's evident when we look at these moss species that occur in really dry environments. We might ask questions. How do they manage to survive in these dry environments? Well, they do so when conditions are optimal and they're adapted to be able to remain dormant when conditions are not so optimal. So the next major branch that we see in the evolution of land plants is that giving rise to the pteridophytes and lycophytes. So that's occurring around here. And this is basically followed by a major innovation we see in the evolution of land plants, which is vascular tissue, and I'll talk about that in a second. But this is something that probably happened on the order of about 350 million years ago, or the common ancestor that gives rise to lycophytes, and pteridophytes probably existed about 350 million years ago. So we can see where they fall in the tree. And in this case now, instead of seeing a gametophyte stage that's dominant and a sporophyte stage that's rather inconspicuous, we're really seeing these two stages of the life cycle reversed. So now the sporophyte stage is going to be dominant and the gametophyte stage is going to be very inconspicuous. So if we track the life cycle of these what we call seedless vascular plants, we could start with a zygote, and this zygote, which is diploid, for all purposes of simplicity anyway, in this example, that diploid zygote will give rise to the sporophyte. And the sporophyte, in this case, we see is kind of leafy. We didn't see that in bryophytes. And so this here is sort of the familiar fern frond, like we see here in Pteridium aquilinum. This is the bracken fern. And so these fronds are the sporophytes. They're actually sporophylls, as I mentioned before. They're highly modified leaves that produce sporangia that are, again, the reproductive structures. So we see a dominant sporophyte stage in these seedless vascular plants. And as I mentioned, if you were to go around looking at fern leaves or fern fronds, you might get lucky and find one that's in its reproductive stage. And on the underside of these leaves, we'd see sori, which are these little sort of cup-like structures. And within these sori, we would see sporangia. And of course, those sporangia are going to undergo meiosis and produce spores. Those spores will disperse into the environment. And again, these are haploid spores. So they have one set of chromosomes in this example. And when conditions are optimal, that is probably conditions that are moist, those spores can germinate. And after those spores germinate, they'll start to undergo mitosis and they'll develop into multicellular gametophytes. And the gametophytes in ferns are, again, very inconspicuous, very small. They're probably about that big. They're not easy to find, but if you hang around in fern country long enough at the right time of year and you keep your eyes open, you can potentially find these gametophytes. And these gametophytes, again, will undergo differentiation into Archegonia and Antheridia, these gametangia. These Archegonia will eventually give rise to egg cells, and these Antheridia will eventually give rise to sperm cells. And if these sperm cells are able to swim around in a sort of fluid environment, they'll find their way from the Antheridia to the Archegonia, and they'll be able to fertilize the egg. And once that egg is fertilized, that will give rise to a diploid zygote, which will basically be the sporophyte. So we have the transition from the gametophyte stage to the sporophyte stage. And sort of like we saw in bryophytes, the gametophyte will nourish the sporophyte and allow that sporophyte to grow. It'll provide photosynthate to that sporophyte, energy essentially that allows the sporophyte to grow and its cells to divide into the familiar body that we see above ground. And the cycle will go ahead and repeat itself. So again, not a terribly different life cycle. There's still the alternation of generations happening. It's just that the sporophyte stage is the dominant conspicuous stage in seedless vascular plants, and the gametophyte stage is really quite inconspicuous. So this is kind of the opposite than we see in bryophytes. We can look at some of the diversity in lycophytes and pteridophytes. There are at least 13,000 species of these things that exist today. There may have been way more in the past. And either way, we have reason to believe from the fossil record that these organisms were much more abundant in the deep, deep past, probably during the Ordovician or the sort of Carboniferous periods long ago, almost before the time of the dinosaurs. These were the kinds of plants that really dominated the landscape. And again, these are plants that typically grow in moist habitats. Today, we find them in tropical forests and temperate forests. So in really warm, wet forests, as we might find in equatorial regions, we can find a lot of pteridophytes. In temperate forests that are cooler but still relatively wet, we can also find a lot of pteridophytes. As I mentioned long ago in the deep past, lycophytes were very, very common. And as a matter of fact, these are lycopods. They took on a tree-like morphology. So this kind of looks like a tree, this cartoon here, but in fact, it is a lycopod. And we know from the fossil record that these lycopods really dominated the landscape quite a long time ago, again, probably before the time of dinosaurs. But today we don't have any living specimens of lycopods that look anything like this. All the lycopods today, or the lycophytes today, I should say, are much reduced. They're very, very small plants. That are generally referred to as club mosses, although they're not mosses at all. They're not bryophytes. They're seedless vascular plants. But nevertheless, we do see some extant or living lycophytes today, such as Selaginella biglovii. This is a lycophyte that is native to Southern California. It occurs in our mountains here. It's not that hard to find. It does occur in relatively sheltered environments, but you'd be surprised that you can find it away from water pretty directly. And sort of like we saw in mosses, it appears that these lycophytes can sort of live in a suspended animation as well. They can kind of remain dormant for long periods of the dry season and sort of spring back into life when conditions are favorable during the rainy season. But nevertheless, these plants aren't that big. They probably only grow to be about that tall. And they are lycophytes nonetheless. We can also talk about equisetum. These are horsetails. And so these are plants that you typically might find growing in moist environments around creeks or streams. And these are the reproductive structures at their tips, by the way. And they have these joints here. So these plants are jointed. They're, by the way, called anthrophytes because of their joints. And you might be asking, where in the world are the leaves on these plants? Well, these particular plants here, they might have some leaves lower down on the stem, but we can see that generally speaking, their stems are green. What does that tell you? Well, probably their stems are undergoing some amount of photosynthesis. Anyway, equisetum as another example of a seedless vascular plant. And then we can get into ferns, probably the most common seedless vascular plants. These are true pteridophytes, things like Polypodium californicum. So this is another relatively common fern species that we have here in Southern California called California polypody. These occur in very sheltered, shady areas that tend to retain moisture pretty well. You're not going to find polypodium in exposed sites. And they do really depend upon sheltered, moist conditions for survival, for undergoing their sort of normal life cycle, as we see here. But as we sort of saw with mosses, not all ferns necessarily do occur in super moist places. For example, Myriopteris perryi is an example of a fern that is native to the California deserts. This is a picture of a fern in Death Valley National Park. And if you know anything about Death Valley National Park, you know that it's one of the driest places in the world and one of the most inhospitable places in the world, and probably one of the last places in the world you'd ever expect to find a fern. Well, nevertheless, we can find populations of Myriopteris perryi in certain regions of Death Valley National Park, where conditions are just ever so conducive to the life cycle of pteridophytes, where the conditions are slightly sheltered, where the conditions might just slightly retain a little bit of moisture. This fern specimen here was kind of growing in the crack at the base of a rock, where the rock sort of was coming out of the ground, or where the rock was sort of nestled in the ground, I should say. And this was a sort of shady, sort of sheltered environment. I wonder who took this picture. Oh, that was me. Anyway, I took this picture in this sort of sheltered rock outcrop of this Myriopteris fern, which was growing in an otherwise completely inhospitable environment. And this picture was taken, on the edge of the dry season. So this fern hadn't seen rainfall in months and months and months, yet it was still green and still undergoing photosynthesis. You might notice that its tissues are not nearly as bright green as we see in Polypodium. And we can start asking questions about why that might be. It might have to do with certain features of these leaves being adapted to reflect bright light when these plants are exposed to bright light, which can help them avoid desiccation, which can help them avoid water loss, being basically fried by the sun when they are exposed to direct light. So that kind of might explain why these Ferns have a really sort of gray-greenish color rather than a bright greenish color. But nevertheless, we can find some fern species in really arid environments, which is sort of an exception to the rule that these pteridophytes and lycophytes usually grow in moist habitats. And just to clarify, these lycopods and Selaginella, these are lycophytes. So these are species that descend from this particular evolutionary branch here. So they have these so-called microphylls or really, really small leaves. Whereas these horsetails, this equisetum, this equisetum here, and these ferns here, these are pteridophytes. So we can see them instead occurring in this evolutionary branch here, so-called ferns and allies. And these are species that generally have megaphylls or larger leaves. So one of the major innovations that we see emerge in the lineage giving rise to lycophytes and pteridophytes is apical meristem. And apical meristem is an interesting artifact of plants that gives rise to shoots and roots. Now, there's probably some kind of primitive apical meristem in bryophytes as well, but we know bryophytes definitely don't have roots. So when we get to lycophytes and pteridophytes, now we're seeing the first plants that have true roots. And this is basically an artifact of the sort of formal evolution of this thing, again, called apical meristem. What is apical meristem? It's basically root or shoot tips that are comprised of undifferentiated cells, which is to say, these are cells whose fate is not predetermined. We can think of a lot of the cells in our own bodies, in our human bodies, as having a very much having a predetermined fate. Those cells are going to differentiate into a particular type of tissue, definitely. Well, in apical meristem, in plants, that's not the case. The shoot apical meristem and the root meristem involve cells that don't necessarily have a predetermined fate. They sort of grow indefinitely until they're needed for one purpose or another. And it kind of allows plants to grow tissue where that kind of tissue is needed. So, for example, if plants need to grow towards light, they can grow more shoot apical meristem. That can allow them to grow taller. If plants need to access water deeper in the soil, they can grow more root meristem, and that can allow them to grow deeper below ground to access water if water's not available close to the surface. So these are really advantageous traits that we see evolving in the lineages, giving rise perhaps to mosses, and certainly that are conserved in the lineages that then later evolve vascular tissue, such as those that gave rise to lycophytes and pteridophytes. And some of these apical shoots, or some of the apical meristem and shoots, also produces these lateral buds. And if you look really closely at a plant stem, you can see these lateral buds. And these lateral buds are, again, undifferentiated plant cells that could give rise to new stem tissue. So an entirely new branch could take off here, or they could give rise to new leaves. So the petiole of a leaf could form here and give rise to a leaf blade, or these lateral buds could give rise to sporophylls, like cones in conifers, which we haven't discussed yet, or flowers in flowering plants, which we haven't yet discussed yet. Future innovations to come down the road, but nevertheless, these lateral buds are forms of apical meristem that are really, really important undifferentiated cells that plants can use to basically continue to grow into various tissues that are needed in order for them to complete their life cycles. And as I sort of mentioned, the evolution of vascular tissue is something that was very important adaptation for life to be able to continue to evolve away from water into drier conditions. Likewise, the evolution of apical meristem also is an important adaptation, allowing plants to make the move away from water. This sort of helps plants to grow taller and access light, which is a trait we did not see in lower plants such as bryophytes. But vascular tissue now is a trait that is really allowing plants to transport water against the force of gravity. That is, to transport water from roots in the soil to shoots above the ground that are maybe even 1 or 2 feet above the ground, such as we see in some various lycophytes or pteridophytes, which are some of the first or earliest tall plants to evolve. They have to be able to move water against the force of gravity. How are they doing this? Well, they're doing this using these interesting structures called xylem. And xylem are basically moving water and minerals from the soil up again to the shoots of these plants, generally toward their leaves where photosynthesis is happening. Again, photosynthesis can't happen without water. And typically, xylem is going to move water in one direction, and that direction is up. And typically, xylem are bound by some dead cells. So the dead cell walls are basically forming the structure of xylem. So these were plant cells that once were alive, died. All the living tissue is gone, but the cell walls remain and provide xylem with their structure. The sort of sister structure to xylem is phloem. And phloem, instead of moving water and minerals, is moving sugars mainly, photosynthate. Typically, it's going to move photosynthate from leaf tissue into the vascular bundles, and that sugar will get moved either up or down the plant stem, depending on where it's needed. And the structure of phloem is a little bit different than xylem. These cells that bind phloem are alive still, but they still need some kind of a support, so they might be bound by some more rigid cells. And phloem have these things called sieve plates, and sieve plates are kind of these little conducting structures in between various cells within the phloem that allow sugars and some other organic molecules to sort of be preferentially transferred through the various layers of phloem tissue, or through the phloem channel, I should say. And unlike xylem, phloem can move sugars in both directions. So they can move sugars against the force of gravity, or they can sort of allow sugars to flow down with gravity, but they can move sugars in both directions. Whereas again, xylem's really only moving water from the roots up towards the shoots against the force of gravity. And you might be wondering, how is it that plants are able to move water against the force of gravity? Well, there are a couple things going on. One is adhesion. So basically, there are these capillary relationships where water is sort of sticking to the interior walls of the xylem. And as water sticks to the interior walls of the xylem, water molecules are sort of attracted to each other because of their polarity. And as one water molecule sort of adheres to the surface of xylem, another water molecule can adhere to that water molecule. And water molecules can sort of climb up the xylem ladder, if you will. That's somewhat effective, but there's another force that also allows plants to move water against the force of gravity. And you may have guessed it, it's evaporation. So as the stomata in the leaves are opening, water is evaporating out of the stomata. And as water is evaporating out of the stomata, that's helping to draw water up the xylem column. So as water is adhering to the inner walls of xylem, it's also being forced up that tube by evaporation. And so plants are effectively able to move water against the force of gravity using these kinds of methods. This is a microscopic view of a plant stem showing what xylem and phloem actually look like at the cellular level. So these structures here are the xylem. And xylem typically are surrounded by phloem. So we typically can think of this situation where there is a column of xylem moving water up toward the shoot, and that column of xylem is surrounded by phloem, which is moving sugars up and down through the shoot, again, moving those sugars to the parts of the plant where they're needed in order to provide an energy source for the plants to do various things. We have evidence that vascular tissue first evolved something on the order of about 430 million years ago. So again, if we look at our phylogeny of early plants, around here, about 430 years ago, we see the earliest fossils that contain plants that did have vascular tissue, providing evidence to suggest that plants that existed prior to this point in time lacked vascular tissue and probably were not very big because they couldn't move water against the force of gravity very easily. They had no roots. They only could move water by diffusion. But now with the advent of vascular tissue, This gives rise to plants that can grow much taller. In addition to having apical meristem and roots, these plants can grow taller shoots than they had in bryophytes. And with this vascular tissue, they can very effectively move water, nutrients, and sugar throughout the plant body and really do a lot better away from wetter conditions and can do a lot better on land than their ancestors had. The next major lineage that we see evolve as plants are making their move away from water towards increasingly drier conditions are the non-flowering seed plants, which are known as gymnosperms. And we can see in our phylogeny that the non-flowering seed plants split from a common ancestor shared with flowering plants about 250 million years ago. With the advent of seeds that they share from a common ancestor that probably evolved sometime before that. And so what are some key characteristics of these plants? Well, generally speaking, most, if not all, non-flowering seed plants are woody. We'll talk about what wood really is. They're generally evergreen, although there are some examples of deciduous taxa, that is, species that will drop their leaves usually during the winter in order to, really as a physiological adaptation to cold conditions, so in order to cope with cold seasons. These are vascular plants, so they have xylem and phloem. They obviously have apical meristem. And these are plants that produce seeds. And now seeds are this really novel adaptation that arises that really allows the embryo of that is a result of fertilization to have a package within which it can be stored and potentially dispersed into the environment and survive for really, really long periods of time. In fact, seeds we know can remain dormant for tens, even thousands of years in some cases. And these seeds are very much desiccation resistant. So we're seeing this major transition from plants that depend upon spores for dispersal, spores for basically allowing the next generation of plants to resume, that really do depend upon water, now are evolving, or rather being replaced by a seed that doesn't necessarily require water for survival. It might require water for germination, but it doesn't necessarily require water for survival. And these seeds can survive desiccation for long periods of time. And another structure that we see emerging in non-flowering seed plants is pollen. And pollen is basically a new adaptation that has emerged that packages sperm or male gametes, or it's a new type of male gametophyte. And pollen, again, is a way that these plants can now really allow their male gametes to survive outside of water. Pollen grains are an adaptation that don't require water for dispersal. As we saw in spore plants, the male gametes really kind of required water in order for the sperm to disperse, to find an egg for fertilization. That's not necessarily happening in non-flowering seed plants. Now they have pollen that can be dispersed in the wind, for example. It can still be dispersed in water, but it doesn't necessarily require water anymore. Again, this is a major adaptation, a major innovation, allowing land plants to survive in increasingly arid conditions. And if we look at the leaves of non-flowering seed plants, we will see a pretty consistent theme that these leaves have pretty tough, waxy cuticles covering their epidermis, which really does allow them to adapt to pretty dry conditions. Not only that, but we see these plants also evolving to survive in particularly cold conditions. And to this day, if we were to go out and look for non-flowering seed plants, not surprisingly, we'd find most of them occurring in environments that are typically relatively dry and that get relatively cold at one time or another during the year. So these are some interesting adaptations we see in non-flowering seed plants, and these lineages first show up in the fossil record. They first show up on the scene about 350 million years ago. And we know that these kinds of organisms were really quite dominant during the so-called Carboniferous period. So probably long ago, not too long before the time of dinosaurs, after the time that lycopods or club mosses, those sort of tree club mosses that we saw in this example here, after the time that lycopods were really, really dominant in the landscape, we see a time where now conifers, or non-flowering seed plants that were mostly trees, became very, very dominant in the landscape. And of course, we actually afford some benefit from the fossilized remains of these taxa or of these organisms because a lot of our automobiles run on the remains of them that we call fossil fuels. So a lot of our crude oil and natural gas sources are the remnants of non-flowering seed plants that lived hundreds of millions of years ago. Pretty interesting. So these things are probably pretty familiar. Conifers fall into this category. So spruces, sequoias, junipers, tamaricks. These are all examples of non-flowering seed plants. Most of them are evergreen, but if we look at tamaracks, we can see examples of deciduous taxa. Likewise, if we talk about the dawn redwood, which you may have heard of, that is a relative of the coast redwood we have in California. The coast redwood's evergreen, but the dawn redwood drops its leaves typically in the winter, again, as do tamaracks. So these are physiological adaptations to particularly cold conditions that happen annually. Things like cycads, and you might be thinking, well, this is a palm tree. So these palm trees are non-flowering seed plants, right? Nope. These are not palm trees. These are cycads. They have compound leaves that very much resemble leaves of palms, but they are not palms by any stretch of the imagination. Palms didn't evolve until much later. And so cycads really don't share any direct common ancestry with palms. And of course, cycads, like other non-flowering seed plants, produce cones. And in these cones, they can produce either pollen in male cones or they can produce seeds in female cones. And we'll look at that life cycle in a second. And then there are some other taxa that fall into this category that are far less obvious as non-flowering seed plants, but they are things like ephedra, which you may have noticed if you've ever traveled up to the higher elevations of the deserts of North America, you can find ephedra. And ephedra has very inconspicuous male and female cones, but they do produce those cones nonetheless. And ephedra, if we were to look closely at it, we'd notice have very reduced, if not entirely non-functional leaves, and they are doing their photosynthesis almost entirely in their stems. But nevertheless, these are examples of non-flowering seed plants as well. So what does the gymnosperm life cycle look like? Well, it's not terribly different than the generalized plant life cycle that we see. They undergo the alternation of generations. Probably one of the key features that makes the gymnosperm life cycle different than either the sort of seedless vascular plant life cycle and the bryophyte life cycle is that the gametophyte stage includes these really desiccation-resistant pollen grains, whereas the sporophytic stage is a protected, very, very well-nourished seed that, again, can remain dormant for long periods of time. And so it might start to appear obvious that the gametophyte stage in these non-flowering seed plants is extremely inconspicuous, not very easy to see. Probably it's easiest to see the pollen grains, whereas the female gametophytes are very inconspicuous. You'd have to crack open a developing seed in order to see it. But typically, we can talk about the life cycle of gymnosperms, perhaps beginning with the sporophyte. So let's imagine a pine tree, for example, which is a mature sporophyte that produces either female cones or male cones, and probably those cones are going to be produced by lateral buds, I would presume. And so there will be some differentiation of that tissue into either sort of male functioning or female functioning, not terribly different than we see with Archegonia and Antheridia. And those female cones will develop a pair of ovules, and those ovules will eventually undergo meiosis and give rise to egg cells. And then the male cones will also undergo meiosis and give rise to these pollen grains. And within these pollen grains are going to be the sperm. And so these pollen grains are haploid in this example. And they represent the male gametophytes that carry male sperm. A lucky pollen grain, which almost always is going to be dispersed by wind, sometimes could be dispersed by water, but it doesn't help male gametophytes in gymnosperms to be dispersed by water so much because they need to access female cones, which are held high up in the branches of trees rather than down low on the ground. So typically these male gametophytes are going to be wind dispersed, And by wind dispersal, the male gametophyte of one pine tree will find its way to the female gametophyte of a separate pine tree. And typically, that male gametophyte will meet that female gametophyte and presumably that male gametophyte will release its sperm into the female gametophyte, allowing fertilization to happen. This actually is going on via a fairly intricate process that is shown in this cartoon. So again, here's our diploid sporophyte that gives rise to its female gametophytes within cones and its male gametophytes within cones, and these are separate male and female cones. And if we look here within the cone scale of a female cone, we see the female gametophyte, which contains a megaspore, and we see that there's a pollen grain, which contains a microspore. Anyway, when these pollen grains attach to the ovule in the female cone scale, that pollen will start to undergo mitosis. This is kind of strange, but this is what happens. So that pollen grain will start to undergo cell division via mitosis. And what is it doing? It's growing a pollen tube. And that pollen tube is extending down towards the ovule where the eggs are contained. And this is the female megaspore. And if that pollen tube is successful at growing toward the ovule, it eventually will allow the sperm cell within the pollen grain to travel down that pollen tube toward the ovule of the female cone scale, and it will fertilize the eggs within that ovule. And once fertilization is successful, then a zygote is formed that is now haploid. So we again go from having our diploid. So we again go from having our haploid microspores and haploid megaspores. Fertilization happens, and now we have diploid zygotes. And those diploid zygotes will start to undergo cell division through mitosis and give rise to embryos. And within those seeds, of course, are the embryos, but also are a new sort of structure that we call endospore, which are food reserves. And so the embryo within the seed actually has this really starchy, sugary food source that it can use to survive for relatively long periods of time as that seed awaits germination. And this is part of what allows these seeds to remain dormant for such long periods of time, is that they sort of are packaged, their embryos are packaged with a food source that they can use for metabolism, albeit very slow metabolism, over long periods of time as that seed awaits germination. Once that seed is germinated, it really gives rise to the true young sporophyte. And if that sporophyte can survive to reproductive maturity, it will eventually give rise again to male and female cones, and this whole cycle will repeat itself. So again, we're seeing alternation of generations, but it's happening in a much different way than we saw in the seedless vascular plants and in the non-vascular spore plants, the bryophytes. A very dominant sporophyte stage and a very, very inconspicuous gametophytic stage. It's almost happening at a microscopic level. And we can look at modern day gymnosperm diversity, which, as it turns out, isn't that diverse compared to what we saw in lycophytes and pteridophytes and bryophytes, which actually turn out to be much more diverse groups. At least to this day, they are much more diverse groups. Only about 1,000 species of gymnosperms that still survive today, and they're generally categorized into 4 major divisions. Those are the Cycadophyta, the Ginkgophyta, the Coniferophyta, and the Cnidophyta. And this phylogeny here kind of illustrates our best interpretation of the evolutionary relationships of these major divisions. Cycads are kind of thought of as the earliest diverging group of gymnosperms, followed by ginkgos. And then when we get into understanding the relationship between Coniferophyta and Cnidophyta, the taxonomy is very messy, and the understanding of the evolutionary relationships is a bit vague still to this day. But nevertheless, the best evidence we have at the moment points towards cnidophytes probably being fairly closely related to conifers. Another major innovation we see emerging prior to the evolution of gymnosperms is wood. And wood is a general term used for what we actually call lignin. And lignin is basically a structure in plants. It's actually chemically kind of complicated, but basically it's something that is formed by vascular tissue in cells that have secondary walls. So we know that what generally differentiates plant cells from animal cells are cell walls. But when we get to the evolution of woody plants, we're now seeing plants that don't just produce a primary cell wall, but between their plasma membrane and their primary cell wall, they're producing this secondary cell wall. We can kind of see an image of what that looks like here. Here is the plasma membrane. Here is the secondary cell wall. And here is the primary cell wall. And typically that secondary cell wall will die back and will form this really tough woody-like structure called lignin. And this image here kind of shows a bundle of lignin shown in orange and bundles of hemicellulose and cellulose shown with other colors. But basically, this lignin surrounds the cellulose. And it's this lignin that is responsible for producing the rings, or the annual growth rings in trees, in tree trunks. And so we can famously look at these tree rings and count them in order to figure out how old these trees are. And typically what's going on is that these tree rings are composed of two kinds of growth, or two separate or two distinctive kinds of secondary cell growth or secondary cell walls that are being put down. They're known as early growth and late growth. So early in the season, when conditions are relatively wet and growth is beginning for the first time in the year, these woody plants will put down their early growth, which is fairly wide. And then as the growing season starts to come to an end, growth will sort of stop, and these plants will put down their so-called late summer or fall growth. But all of these growth rings are formed by secondary cell walls, which are dead cell walls that really do give these plants a lot of structural support and also provide these plants with protection from cold conditions. And as you recall, when we talk about gymnosperms, we're really talking about lineages that have evolved with adaptations to increasingly drier and often colder conditions than the ancestors of these land plants had typically had to deal with before. And this represents an important move of these plants towards increasingly more hostile conditions than their ancestors had to deal with. So by virtue of evolving these structures that we call wood, these plants not only have increasingly more structural support for their vascular tissues, so their xylem and phloem can now more effectively transport water and nutrients through their stems, but they also can grow taller and form tree trunks that enable these plants to access light at higher and higher levels, say above the forest floor, if we're talking about a forest environment. And again, can help them deal with increasingly colder conditions that many of these species encountered as they evolved further away from water, oftentimes evolving further away from water in more tropical conditions towards areas that are increasingly drier in more temperate conditions. And then lastly, I think it's really neat to point out that amongst these gymnosperms are some really, really extreme organisms that kind of go above and beyond anything we can see in any other living things that we really know of on this planet, be it bacteria, archaea, fungi, or animals, or protists. There are some really exceptional lifestyles that some of these conifers have, and we can think of these as being coniferous superlatives. And some of these features, such as apical growth and vascular tissue and lignin, are all traits that really have allowed some conifers to have evolved to do some pretty amazing things. And so amongst conifers, we can find both the tallest living plants in the world, the largest living plants in the world, in fact, the largest living organisms in the world by volume, and the oldest single free living species or tree species that we can find in the world. And so maybe not surprisingly or interestingly, all three of these species are native to the state of California. And so what are they? Well, we can talk about coast redwoods, Sequoia sempervirens, and coast redwoods do indeed include the world's tallest organisms, or the tallest trees in the world are coast redwoods, which occur in the coast of Northern California. And from the fossil record, we know that coast redwoods were once distributed across much, if not most, of North America. Their distribution was very widespread long ago, not long after they first evolved. But of course, we know that today they only occur in a relatively very narrow niche, a very narrow band of habitat just along the California coast that extends basically from the very tip of southern Oregon along the coast of Northern California down into central California into the so-called Big Sur region. It's about as far south as redwoods, coast redwoods naturally occur. They don't occur very far inland. And we think that that's because these tree species generally rely upon fog as a source of moisture. And so once you go inland, there's not so much fog, but along the coast, there's typically a lot of fog in California. And so this provides a pretty suitable habitat for these conifers to survive. And they're really quite extraordinary organisms that dominate their ecosystems in a magnificent way. Obviously, trees that can grow hundreds of feet tall are hard to miss, and it's not hard to understand that they can become very, very dominant features of their ecosystems, not just in terms of the photosynthesis that they're doing, but in terms of the way that redwoods really shape the environment all around where they occur. And all of the other organisms that co-occur with coast redwoods have to deal with environments that are sort of cool, that are very shaded, that are typically kind of damp, that are typically have their own micro atmosphere, their sort of their own microclimate that doesn't exist beyond the redwood forest. So redwood forests are very, very special places that are occupied by these exceptionally tall trees. A very close relative of coast redwoods are the giant sequoias. And giant sequoias likewise occur in a very, very narrow band of habitat, but rather than occurring on the coast, they only occur on the western slopes, on the coast-facing slopes of the Sierra Nevada mountains. But they're kind of far inland, on the order of maybe 50 to 80 miles inland on the west coast of the Sierra Nevada mountains. And these tree species share some characteristics in common with coast redwoods. They have really thick bark, and we think that that thick bark is an adaptation that allows them to resist fire. And maybe likewise, both of these tree species hold their foliage very high off the ground. And we actually see this in a lot of California conifers, but we certainly do see it in both coast redwoods and giant sequoias, where their bark or their foliage rather is held so far off the ground. And probably if these trees were to experience a wildfire, their foliage, their leaves wouldn't burn. So they'd be able to survive the effects of wildfire, presumably, if that fire didn't reach its way up into the so-called crown of the tree. And again, this thick bark affords them another adaptation to resist fire. Some giant sequoias have bark that might be as thick as 2 feet. That's about, well, thicker than my hands can extend across this screen. That's pretty thick bark. And we think that that's a very, very important adaptation that has enabled these conifers to coexist with fire, which, believe it or not, is a natural component of these kinds of ecosystems. In fact, we can look and see a fire scar at the base of this sequoia here. But that fire didn't kill this tree, presumably because this tree is adapted to fire, and presumably because this was a relatively low intensity fire. It probably had occurred quite long ago in the life of this tree. And these sequoias are most famous for being the world's largest trees by volume, if not the world's largest organisms by volume. They are truly magnificent and can dwarf anything in the environment that surrounds them, be it another conifer of a different species, or a vertebrate taxa or an invertebrate taxa, or a human. If we had a human standing next to this tree, they would indeed be dwarfed. If you've ever had the opportunity to see these trees, I'm sure you were probably in awe at their incredible magnificence. Their incredible size is really just sort of overwhelming. And both coast redwoods and giant sequoias can live for a really long time. I think coast redwoods can live up to something on the order of about 2,000 years, and I think giant sequoias can live on the order of something up to 3,000 years. So these are potentially very, very long-lived organisms and potentially very large organisms that are really just quite incredible. And they have a quite interesting evolutionary history. And amongst long-lived conifers, we can talk about the bristlecone pine. And the bristlecone pines occur scattered across the tops of mountain ranges, sort of going from eastern California to western Utah, which kind of means they occur in mountain ranges all the way across the entire state of Nevada. But they only occur at relatively high elevations where conditions are favorable to their growth, so they're very well adapted to extremely or relatively dry conditions, I should say, not extremely dry conditions like Death Valley, but relatively dry conditions compared to, say, the conditions that the coast redwood lives in. So these trees are adapted to pretty dry conditions, obviously very cold conditions. The ground around them is covered in snow most of the year. More often than not, they're dealing with snow. And a lot of the times they occur in very nutrient poor soil, which kind of affords them the opportunity to overcome competition with other tree species and other plant species. So they can do really, really well in this interesting niche that's dry, cold, nutrient poor. And looking at these trees, you might think they don't look like much. As a matter of fact, they look more dead than alive. Well, in fact, they are more dead than alive. Most of this tissue here is dead tissue that lived a really long time. But if you were to, upon closer investigation, look at the tissues of these trees, you notice that they have narrow strips of living tissue that connects their roots to their foliage. And they indeed still are doing photosynthesis at the tips of their branches with leaves, and there are still portions of these trees that remain alive. And we can start asking questions about just how old might these trees be, and why did it ever cross anyone's mind to ask that question and actually investigate it? Well, some researchers started to put two and two together that looking at these trees suggests that they might be really old because they have really wide trunks. And so some inquisitive researchers decided to core out cross sections of these trees to look at their patterns of rings and look at their variable patterns of early growth and late growth and count those rings and figure out just how old some of these trees are. And researchers were astonished when they saw the results of those surveys that pointed towards the reality of just how old these bristlecone pines are. Can you take a guess at how old the oldest bristlecone pine in the world is? Over 4,700 years old. In fact, approaching 5,000 years. And many, many other individuals are not quite that old, but still in excess of 3,500, 4,000 years old. This is a really, really long time for these trees to live. I mean, think about all of the historical events in human history that have happened while this single tree was standing in the same place for thousands of years, millennia and millennia, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. This predates most of human history, most of certainly human written history. These trees have been standing there. And as a matter of fact, these trees represent a living laboratory with which we can study climate change because, as it turns out, the width of these tree rings is correlated with annual temperature and annual rainfall. Warmer conditions and wetter conditions tend to give rise to wider tree rings. And so researchers have studied these tree rings going back thousands of years in bristlecone pines and seen variation in the pattern of relatively wide tree rings and relatively narrow tree rings that point toward periods of time when the climate was relatively warm and wet versus periods of time when the climate was relatively cool and dry, going back thousands of years. And this has been very informative for allowing us to understand how the Earth's climate has sort of changed over the last several thousand years, and changed it has indeed. So that's it for this video. We'll pick it up again with flowering plants in the next section.